Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. In today's episode, we're diving into the world of supply chain emissions with Alex Todorovic from Arbor. Arbor aims to be the world's most accurate carbon management platform that quickly calculates the carbon impact of products, assets, and supply chains with a high degree of accuracy. Arbor transforms data into actionable insights paired with climate data and expert guidance, and enables organizations to confidently quantify their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. With his extensive background in both software and business development, Alex has put his sights on combating climate change. Today, we explore the challenges faced by companies around the world as they're decarbonizing their operations. This includes their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are the direct emissions that they own and indirect emissions from energy they use, as well as Scope 3 emissions, which include all the emissions embodied in their supply chains. Emissions reporting is complex, but companies are increasingly being required to report on them, and getting it wrong can lead to greenwashing. In my conversation with Alex, we talk about how Arbor is helping companies measure emissions across supply chains and the regulatory pressures that are emerging. Alex shares the origins of Arbor, the team's firsthand experience with wasteful supply chains, and how they're harnessing network effects to unlock data across industries. Let's get into it. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It's a pleasure.
So I'm excited to dive into the world of life cycle emissions with you. We got linked up late last year, and I was really stoked about how you folks are approaching the carbon management and mitigation space. So to kick us off, could you give us the lowdown on the origins of Arbor and kind of how the company came to be?
Yeah, so the company is founded by there's four of us that are founders, and we met mostly through university. I was working at the university while doing my undergrad, and I was doing computer science, working at this place that was an entrepreneurial center, the U of C, University of Calgary, and I was the tech guy, basically. No one really was focused on software there, so a lot of the questions that I got were like from other founders, essentially like, how do I build this product? How do I build a team around building this product? Who should I hire? And then I talked to also like connected to with a lot of investors in the local scene. So it really helped me broaden my horizons of what was possible and also expand my network. And I just saw, like every question that I had or like every interaction I had, I just felt more and more like I could do this. Like if I wanted to do something on my own, I could. It's not as scary or like unattainable as it seemed before. And yeah, I met the other guys. They had a similar kind of feeling of they wanted to test the waters on doing their own thing. So we would enter in, and this was around like beginning of 2020, like really early 2020. We would enter in like a lot of hackathons in like different challenges that were going on. And we also had our own little company that was like a software services company that we were doing. Just as like a test of how to even like make a company. What does incorporation look like? What does like finances look like getting business? It was a pretty low risk test. And we were able to get some projects and stuff like that and learn how each other work. And we were starting to get that knowledge. And there was this one hackathon that was it was like a Canada-wide Microsoft challenge about AI and like sustainability and stuff like that. And it started like right before COVID hit, basically. So we were doing this thing. And then COVID hits, they had to change it to like purely all online because it's like if you were to get to the final stage, you would go to an event in Montreal and like basically get to present live. They had to get access, so it was like all purely online. And we were doing this over like a course of like 3 months, and we ended up actually winning.
Wow.
We won the sustainable like economies and cities part, and that was like, I think there's over like 400 teams Canada-wide that we're up against. And yeah, from there was like a very, very early iteration idea of what Arbor is today, which was basically utilizing data to give some group of stakeholders information about like what the products and like the purchases look like on the environmental side. At that point in time, it was really focused on consumers because like we couldn't get like a business to work with us right away. So it was like, we'll just kind of work from an external point of view of looking at their products, looking at what they offer, what we could get from their websites and marketing, and then trying to access data on the back end to be able to provide some sort of consumer information around those pieces. And then one thing led to another. I reached out to some contacts that I had made once we won that hackathon in the summer. I reached out. One was James Lockery, who leads Thin Air Labs here in Calgary. He's like a big dude in the Canadian, what's called the tech ecosystem. He co-founded Wave Financial. They got acquired for like the biggest tech acquisition that like at that point in time in Canada has ever been seen. So he went from literally like the very beginning napkin drawing of an idea of a company to all the way to the acquisition. And I was like, this is the guy. Like, I need to talk to and learn from this dude. Everyone else, you know, it's great, but he's the one ultimately that was like top of our list. And he and I actually talked about something else unrelated a while back, and I was pretty sure he wasn't going to remember me. But yeah, as soon as I emailed him, he was like, oh, Alex, great to hear from you again. Like, let's hop on a call. I would love to know like what you're doing and what you're discussing. And we talked on the phone. He was like, you know, I don't know if this is the idea in its current iteration. I don't know if this is the idea, but I like your guys' team. Let's touch base in like 2 months and see what you guys can come up with, basically. And that was our go time. Work as hard as possible, get as much traction as we could to show this guy, to convince him. Yeah. Hop back on another call, and this was like close to the end of 2020. And he was like, yeah, okay, I see the motivation. I see your guys' team. Like, you know, the market will, your product will probably evolve, but I'm in. And he decided to basically lead our first round from there. And the company since then, I'm sure we'll probably get into this later, but like what we do has changed since then. But it's still along the same line of like providing information to stakeholders. And now we're a lot more rooted into emissions. So the emissions impact of their supply chain, their product decisions, the materials they use, all of these different things.
Right. And so at that maybe follow-up conversation, did you have that kernel of this is emissions, or was it still the consumer-focused product at that point?
Yeah, at that point we were using... So it was funny because if you look on Google Trends, you can see like search words and how often they get used. And so in 2020, when we started doing this project, we tapped into ESG data, and like no one was talking about ESG. Like one of the guys in one of our co-founders was taking a class at U of C, and he was doing half business, half comp sci. And he was basically like, oh, like in one of my profs said something about this ESG thing. Let me look into it. And so we started looking into it, and, you know, it was immediately obvious that it was a really bad metric if you're going to make decisions around stuff, because it's very qualitative and not quantitative. Like, it was a lot of really flowery BS around social and environmental and governance. And so we were like, okay, what data sets are these things pulling from to get that information? And what we pulled into was more into like the life cycle assessment stuff and like data sets around like supply chain. And that was where it was like, okay, you know, the world is putting a lot of resources and money and time into building out frameworks and like methodology that are standardized around emissions. And so for us to even just feel comfortable about putting information out there, like to influence things, we had to do it in something that was rooted by like actual science and math and like quantification. And that's where kind of we gravitated towards emissions from there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it seems like this kind of came about from a little bit of maybe like serendipity, like this challenge coming up and then kind of coming across ESG and then discovering that within that there's a real problem to be solved. Is that kind of how things went down? Like, were you going out looking for, we want to solve a climate problem, or was it kind of a combination of discovery?
So our goal, even with that services company that we started, at some point in time, we wanted to make our own thing. So that was kind of like the big overarching was like, we wanted to have our own product and our own company around that product. But we always wanted to be rooted into something that was like a tangible, real human impact. So there's always that meme of like, if you ever watch like Silicon Valley, is like making the world a better place. Right. Every startup always talks about that. We wanted to avoid that, but like actually try to make people's lives better. And what we saw was something that during COVID especially, there was a lot of talk around like environment because there was, people were quarantining, there was less human activity, like the whole nature is healing thing that people were
Yeah,
joking
yeah.
around about. But it was legit. Like, and it seemed to us that it was people actually, it was a good time because people started caring about it more because they saw the after effects. And so, we thought, okay, we have this skill set in data and like product technology. How can we use that to influence as much as we could on like a global scale, link people together or businesses together, whatever it is, and try to tackle towards climate? And one of the founders in our company, he's from Pakistan. Like he grew up in a lot of those, like he grew up in an area that is just so polluted, like it's basically a dumping ground for companies and manufacturers and stuff like that. So he has a lot of firsthand experience. And like a lot of the things that he said resonated with all of us. Like I come from, so I was born in Bosnia and like I immigrated to Canada when I was like 7. Uh, Pretty war-torn country, and we didn't really do things environmentally friendly or like efficiently. I don't think still it doesn't get taken care of. So that was something that was always like a big piece that we thought about when it came to like our futures, basically.
That makes a lot of sense. That's yeah, that's interesting how those like very early experiences are things that you kind of bring with you. You mentioned the founders a couple of times. How did your founding team come together? It seemed like most of you were at University of Calgary. How did you all find each other and kind of come together?
Yeah, so it was in my last year that I had this one class that almost honestly like sparked this whole thing, this like entrepreneurial spirit or flame, if you want to call it.
Hmm.
But it was basically like it was a iOS development course. So like iOS is basically like the Apple related apps. But it wasn't about like all my courses up until that point were really like rooted into like theory or like programming. This one was it was kind of just acknowledging that that was already something that you understood, and it was more about you're gonna build out this concept, maybe like a demo or whatever it is, but like how would you monetize it? How would you build like a business around it? And that's the part that really like, hooked me into it.
It's
And
big, yeah.
so the first one that I met out of the co-founders was Ben. And he and I just really connected like right off the bat because like we were really focused on, I don't know, we just found it really fun and like we were just really focused on making the most out of this. But through that, working with Ben, I met his brother Danny, which is like a couple of years younger than him, and he is one of the co-founders. And then Abdullah, which he came on later. We joke about this. He like pinged me on LinkedIn, and then we essentially went on like a date. He like, can I buy you a beer? Like, I'm new to
Right.
Calgary. I heard you were the guy to talk to about like cool stuff, and I was like, I didn't
Yeah.
know I had this reputation. And so we literally like he like bought me like a couple of beers. We just sat and talked for like 4 hours, and from there I was like, okay, I think I have a good feeling around this guy. Like, I'll bring
Yeah.
him into like the stuff that we're working on, and it kind of just went from there.
Amazing. There's nothing like the power of a random reach out and like
Yeah,
going for a quick coffee or a drink, and you never know where it's going to end up.
yeah.
Cool. Well, let's maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about Arbor today. How is the product change? But what is Arbor doing today from an emission standpoint?
Yeah, the product that we have is like this big data machine that we've built. From there, you can put like an interface on it, you can make the user experience whatever it is, but that's not really the product. The product is like this data that we have access to. And really the goal is to be that single source of truth when it comes to, for now, like the emission side. We want to expand into other things like waste, water usage, like land usage. But those things, those models right now are still pretty far behind in terms of like how effective they would be in like a confidence standpoint. And so what we offer is essentially we work with customers to get something called primary data, which is like data from them about their supply chain. So anything that they have that's like the ground truth of like, okay, we get it from here, we ship it this way, we use this material, we all as much as we can possibly get around their supply chain. Now, what happens nowadays is like for a lot of companies, they don't really have a whole lot of information on their supply chain, especially if they don't own that supply chain. So if they're contracting out manufacturers, contracting out delivery, like it gets really messy and difficult to track what's happening when. And so that's where we rely on our data, which we call our secondary data. this is information that we've been pulling together from a bunch of different sources of like life cycle assessment databases, different energy grid information, transportation routes, commodities, like how do they move around, manufacturing info. And we fill in the blanks basically. And we're really hyper focused on looking at like a very regional view. So if you're telling us that like your product is manufactured in China, we want to know where in China. Because based on the data that we have, one section could be coal powered, one section of China could be powered by hydro or like solar, whatever it is. And those are totally different emission numbers that we have to take account for. We try to make as much of like a objective, unbiased like approach to this, that if you don't give us data that changes the results in terms of like a more, let's say you're doing something more sustainable or whatever it is, the onus is on the company to prove that and show that to us. Otherwise, we'll rely on like a very objective, like almost like a worst case scenario analysis on these things to make sure that people aren't greenwashing, that we're not greenwashing, saying things that aren't true, basically.
Yeah, it'd be like in if you're looking at the grid in Canada too, you know, your emissions, if you were manufacturing in Ontario or Quebec, for example, with all the hydropower, is going to be super different than if you're in a province where maybe it's primarily coal or oil like and gas Alberta. Or whatever it may be. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So you're kind of taking, okay, we have a good picture of your company's data based off of what you provided, but there's some gaps. And so we're going to give you a complete picture, close those gaps with the typical picture in these regions based off of our data set. Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly. And we try to get like extremely granular because whatever the specific thing that we're looking at, whether it's like a product or an asset, like we looked at buildings, for example, look at the building materials that go into like a building, server housing, whatever it is. We want to make it specific to that thing. So it's not like we're going to take a category average and be like, oh, okay, across the board, like, you know, cars, this is the number for cars, and we're just going to multiply by the number. It's more like that specific make, that specific model, the specific materials that go into it, to try to just get as much of like a granular number and impact that accuracy. And what we try to employ is this thing called a data quality rating. So like anytime we give calculations or data to a customer, it's accompanied by this thing called a data quality rating, which is a score basically of how confident we are in that. So the more data we get from the customer, that's like that primary data, the higher the confidence goes up because that's more closer to like what's actually happening. And it also gets impacted by like how accurate we have in terms of like the secondary data on that specific thing. So we're trying to be transparent, and it's like, okay, if the garbage data was involved in this, you have like a 50% confidence interval, knowing that you have a lot of room for improvement, that year over year you can give us more information and bump up that rating.
Yeah, it seems from a corporate perspective that this is a good way to almost set expectations around your emissions. As in, rather than saying we have this super great picture, everything looks great, but it's actually, we have a bunch of data gaps. And then you have to go back to your stakeholders and say, hey, actually, it wasn't that great. You can kind of start off with, hey, it's this good. The data quality is maybe that 50%. We're going to keep working on this. Take it with a grain of salt. And you almost like lower your reputational risk by doing that.
That's the whole entire goal. Like it's about to get a lot more strict, but in the past, even like 5 or 6 years, there's been quite a lot of instances where companies have been caught kind of just, greenwashing. Like they make claims that are extremely vague or maybe painting something with a really broad stroke, and then they get like fined, sued, lose a lot of customer trust. And the customer could be an end consumer, customer could be a wholesale buyer, like it could be anything, right? And I find that it's in their best interest to be as transparent as possible around these things and what goes into it, because that's how you're going to set yourself up for the future, basically.
Right. You can kind of see these things coming, set yourself up for stricter and stricter regulations. Have you run into any of those regulating bodies, and, you know, have like, what's their take on your approach? Like, I know you're using some of the established frameworks that are out there, but Have you run into any of those regulating bodies and gotten any like input from them?
Yeah, that's our goal, is to try to work with them as much as possible and like make sure that, because it's from a validation standpoint. Like we don't want to just say, trust us, bro, like we're totally legit. We just want someone that we want
Yeah.
anybody that can come in that can kind of verify this stuff. And so there's this thing called GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. They are essentially like the leaders in the space in terms of reporting on the different scopes of emissions, the frameworks that are utilized, how you go about communicating those things, and like the methodologies used. And so our platform, like our company, is certified by GRI, and like we spent several months going back and forth with them. They went and took a deep dive into our platform. They looked through like how we are presenting this information, how we're structuring it, and so they gave us that certification. That is one piece that's kind of the biggest point. But we are in current talks with a lot of these different bodies. So like there's in Canada this thing called the OSFI, which is like the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, something like that. They're putting together a number of different regulations that kind of affect financial institutions. And we're in constant communication with them of where is this going? What's the plan here? We're also trying to figure out, because they're looking for us to like work on some data workshops together and stuff like that, because we're
Okay.
data experts. We're not
Yeah.
regulatory experts, right? So it's a pretty complementary relationship that we're trying to kind of build out there.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. Can you tell me a little bit more about the data side of this? You mentioned that there's data sets that you're able to pull this information from. How much of that data is you tapping into existing data sets? Are there parts of it that are proprietary that you own? Like, what does that side of the equation look like?
Essentially, like when we first started this, we were looking at a bunch of different publicly available data sets. It is a bit of like an ocean out there in terms of what the data that's available, but sifting through and figuring out what is actually useful was the real challenge. And so that's where we utilized machine learning to be able to help us out, figure out and build models and start fitting this together into like a singular structure that was useful. From there, we started unlocking more like private data sets, which where you had to either sometimes like apply for membership, sometimes you have to pay for it as our resources. And we've kind of just been building out this like monster. That gives you one layer. The other layer that is proprietary to us is the inferences you can make from that data. So for example, like industry data that like every time we work with like a customer or like unlock a new industry, we can see what is happening and be able to actually like use that information into our system. This is all like part of our contracts and like all these pieces when we analyze a supply chain. We deassociate it. We make sure that everything is like randomized and anonymized,
Right.
but we still apply it to our models to make them more accurate. The other piece is that once you have all these data connections, it's almost like Facebook, where you would put in information about yourself when you're making a profile, and then you would add people as your friends. Now, Facebook can look at those people and learn from them, learn about you. And now they have this data set that like you didn't explicitly tell them, but based on common interests, based on whatever it is, they are learning more information about you. And so that's kind of the same thing for us, is being able to start connecting the dots on suppliers, different supply chain activities. Like it's harder to get access to that unless you're actually working and doing it. And so that part is proprietary to us, being able to kind of take that one step below to that granularity level and be able to kind of own that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective on the network. And as you add more node, like your view of the world essentially expands for each node that you add to the
Yeah.
network. Carbon management can seem like a crowded space. It seems like an industry that's kind of emerged very quickly around this space. And there are some big incumbents like SAP, I think Salesforce, that are making moves in the space. How are you thinking about the competitive landscape and differentiating Arbor?
Yeah. We've gone out and done this analysis, and like from talking to people who currently work there, who have worked there, for people like that used to use these platforms, the biggest thing that they're always missing, or I guess two biggest things. One is they generally have a really big struggle with scope 3, so which is like that information of that scenario they describe where they don't own their supply chain. So like they're contracting out this person and this person, whatever it is. And that's like over 90% of a company's emissions
Right.
because when it comes to manufacturing, transportation, all stuff like that, in the 1960s or 70s, I think, that's when Scope 3 became a problem was because in the West, everyone started kind of offshoring their development and like manufacturing to other places and then being like, well, the emissions aren't my problem because I don't own that, like it's being done somewhere else. And around 2010 or something like that, or 8, that's when Scope 3 was invented because all of a sudden it was like, well, no, it is your problem. Like you're utilizing it to provide your service and your product. You need to be able to track that and encapsulate it into the overall like emissions story. And so what they're struggling with is all these platforms are really good at working with the customer and collecting that primary data, so information from them. But that stuff is so unreliable. Like you will go send forms or calls like suppliers and you'll just get a bunch of garbage back. Like it'll be like 7 different languages, like they're not motivated to provide you anything, to be honest, as like a supplier.
Right.
And so you have to have like some sort of objective, unbiased database that can provide a level of confidence, but it is taking from like a perspective of like more of an outside view so that there's transparency. And that's what we're really good at is being able to go into that like granular level. So if you're looking at like an exact specific product, they struggle with that. And they tend to struggle a lot with having access to good secondary data, which like that's where we knew where this is going to go. Like you're not going to have companies reporting all their emissions tomorrow, but you need to start figuring out like how does one company's emissions affect yours. And so you need to have this kind of like unbiased database. And the other thing is that we're the closest thing that it comes to like an actual automated platform. Like we really focused on ease of use, like taking the burden off of people having to do this stuff. I would say a lot of our competitors on the outside, it looks like they're a tech company. On the inside, it's consultants. It's like a nice face to a data collection template or whatever it is. And then they pull that in, and then it's literally just people doing this work by hand on the back end, which just takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money. If you introduce automation into that, you are able to make this just like it's with everything. Like if you make it easier and more accessible, there'll be a lot more adoption. And that's really our core mantra. Like we've had companies that apply for funding grants and stuff like that, and they're like, I have 2 weeks to get this information by the application deadlines, and they come to us because no one else can do it in that time. And it's because we're just focusing a lot on that efficiency. You know, when people were playing checkers, we were playing chess this whole time. Like we knew where this was going to get to, and a lot of people were building solutions to fit the needs of today, and the needs of today are very different than the needs of 5 years from now. So
no, and that seems like such a consistent theme through your story is building that long-term where this is going versus what are people asking for or feel obligated to do today.
Exactly.
We'll shift gears a little bit. I would love to hear a little bit about what growth looks like today. What are some of your customers look like what is the kind of ideal profile, and what are you hearing from them in like sales conversations and that?
Yeah, our growth has been kind of crazy. So the first year that we started selling our product, like it took some time since the inception of the company. I would say the true inception was like January 2021. Like that was when we closed our first round. That was when we started actually building something. When we started sales was around it was like May, June of 2022. And so in 2022, we were able to get about 4 customers, made some revenue. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was our first kind of like stab at sales. Last year, we went from 4 customers to 18 customers and significantly increased in revenue. And it's not like a big part of it. It's kind of like, you know, our product is better than it was. Our sales process and like us being able to sell like has increased quite a bit, but it's also the pressure and like the speed at which these companies need this information that has changed. So there's a lot more regulatory pressure coming in, a lot more money being essentially locked behind this information. So like if you're going to get loans out for projects, like in the US, for example, like energy projects, you have to provide this information to get even the money. So as soon as money is being tied to it, all of a sudden everyone's kind of panicking and racing for a solution. And I would even say that even like right now, we're still only scraping the surface. Like this is
Yeah.
going to get way more serious, like way more important to your bottom line because we're already seeing the regulations being proposed coming in. They're, 2, 3, 4 years out.
Hmm.
But that amount of time when it comes to your supply chain for a business is like no time at all. Yeah.
Yeah. And you also don't want to be in a place 3 years from now scrambling to clean up your supply chain, 'cause that just has a knock-on effect of your ability to actually deliver your products to customers.
Exactly. And in terms of like customer profiles and stuff like that,
Hmm.
we started in retail. That was where everything we thought was easier to start off with. And so when I say retail, I mean like, fashion products, bags, like t-shirts, pants. Is mainly because it was easier. They had less amount of materials and we could kind of tap into databases that had information on that. But from there, what we realized was like, if you're tracing the supply chain journey of like a t-shirt, you need to have information on the energy grid because you need to look at manufacturing. You need to have information on transportation so that you're just like basically unlocking all these different industries by just looking at a t-shirt. And that's kind of what happened was like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden we were getting requests from companies like, can you, monitor my transportation? Can you do an assessment? I was like, yeah. And so now we've done industries like construction, finance, electronics, agriculture, like you name it at this point.
Wow.
And everyone always on the outside thinks that it's like a different product for each thing, but it's actually
Mm.
all the same thing. You're just basically unlocking data to be able to service that industry.
Right. Yeah. Kind of going back to that network node approach keeps unlocking
Exactly.
things. Yeah. And when you're looking ahead to the next year, what are some of the main goals that you have for the company?
I would say this year is really focused on us just growing the business in terms of like revenue and customers. We have, I would say, by far the best product in the market. Like if you do a side-by-side comparison when it comes to like data, usability, like just the user experience and journey, it's the best one. And so we feel confident in the product development side. We'll still do a little bit here and like trying to unlock more data, but now is basically the go time to just sell. So the goal is to just get in everyone's face, make sure that they know who we are, what we do, and really ramp that side up. Right now, it's probably the worst time to raise money, honestly,
Right.
in the last like X amount of years.
Yeah.
So the goal is to delay that Series A and use like revenue and residual finances to be able to push that out. And probably sometime in like early 2025, we'd be starting to look at like an A round.
Yeah. Nice. So I'm conscious of time here. So I want to hit you with the rapid fire and then we can wrap it up. I had like 25 other questions I would love to
I
get
know.
into with you, but I had to be a little picky here.
It's fair.
Yeah. So I'll hit you with a couple of rapid fire questions. Top of your head, doesn't need to be too much thought into it. Number one, what's a piece of advice you would offer someone who wants to switch into climate but hasn't made the jump yet?
Just understand that like you have to balance two things. One is definitely like movement forward to climate, but if you want, especially businesses, like if you want businesses on board, you have to speak their language. So there's something like there's environmental sustainability, but there's also like financial sustainability. And
Mhm.
when you marry those two, that's the true solution. So even for us, it's like, hey, like a perfect example of this is like how hotels have started now to wash things less as like being sustainable. It's not just that. It's costing them less to do
Yeah.
that. And like that's a great example of like creative solutions that help create a win-win scenario. So I think that's probably something to keep in mind.
Love it. What's a book, podcast, or newsletter that you would recommend to folks?
Book I just read, The Hard Thing About Hard Things,
Nice.
by Ben Horowitz. And
Yeah.
yeah, that one's really good. Like if you're a founder and you're stuck into shit, just reading that, you're like, yeah, it can always get worse, and I have to be prepared for that.
And it probably will.
Exactly. And you just need plans A through Z basically to
Yeah.
just always be prepared.
Nice. And finally, where can people find you and any ask for folks listening?
You can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. Shoot me a message. I'm usually pretty responsive. An ask, I don't know. I think it's more asking, like if you're an end consumer or like an end customer or something, like just asking more questions around where did this come from? What's the impact on this? Just being a little more critical around that because yeah, we consume a lot of shit and like I think a lot of people don't really even realize like what that looks like, if you were to put it into like a year's worth and like put it into a pile, it'd probably shock a lot of people. And so I think just thinking more about that responsible consumption and having an open mind to both sides, like one side of it being the environmental side, the other side of it being like the it has to make sense side, and trying to kind of think in those spheres. There's a lot of divisiveness. One side is like, yeah, like I'm gonna go chain myself to a tree, and like if we don't do this, like we're gonna die. The other side is like, I don't need to do anything because, you know, I haven't had enough proof that like it's not 100% yet. And it's not about like a 0 or a 1. There's all so much in between that can be done to just start. And so like I think it's just kind of from both perspectives trying to find that middle balance.
Love that. Cool. Yeah. Creating demand and less polarization, I think. Less black and white solutions.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Alex, thanks so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you for having me. It was great. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.